All right, well, let's go ahead and get started here. Let me begin again with the definition of spiritual awakening so that we are all on the same page as to what we are actually exploring. Again, this is from the Frontiers in Psychology website. Spiritual awakening is a term given to describe a subjective experience in which an individual's ego transcends their ordinary, finite sense of self to encompass a wider, infinite sense of truth or reality. These deeply embodied noetic experiences are often perceived as a direct connection, communion, or non-dual merging with an unlimited and universal consciousness, the divine, or God in perceived oneness. Experiences of spiritual awakening, whether gradual or sudden, intentionally induced or spontaneous, typically evoke an ineffable sense of deep inner knowing, understanding, remembering, or unveiling of one's true nature, as well as experiences of peace and equanimity, bliss, ecstasy and aliveness, feelings of awe, sacredness, gratitude and reverence, and of abundant, unconditional love. These profound experiences may also trigger a sense of transcendence of time and space, as well as an increase in physical and mental sensitivity to internal and external stimuli, including sensitivity to color, light, touch, sounds, and smells. Now, I'll give you a second to kind of absorb all that, because that is quite a bit of information, quite a definition. Let me say right off the bat that in my research about psychedelics, whether it's LSD or psilocybin, which is the substance in magic mushrooms, or DMT, these substances often produce an experience exactly like the definition we just read. And I admit it's tempting after researching this, especially the work being done at Johns Hopkins, to become a kind of evangelist, but I will try to remain as objective as I can. So let's briefly look at the history of psychedelics. Now, my interest in the topic first came from reading this book, The Immortal Key, by Brian, and I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Murarescu. Murarescu posits the idea that psychedelic substances were used in the classical Greek world, in the Eleusinian mystery cult, which was considered a sacred, once-in-a-lifetime experience that nearly all the great political leaders and philosophers, including Socrates, participated in. And those who went through the ritual supposedly lost all fear of death. Murarescu goes further by conjecturing that communion, the essential sacrament of the Christian faith, listen to this, communion may have involved psychedelic substances. Now, this may seem far out and even ridiculous. However, Christian art from the Middle Ages may indeed support Murarescu's thesis, and I'm going to show some of these images later so that you can make up your own mind on this idea. But now let's look at the recent history of these drugs. Swiss chemist Albert Hoffman, immortalized here by artist Alex Gray, was the first to synthesize LSD. We know the exact date, November 16th, 1938. Hoffman was trying to obtain a respiratory and circulatory stimulant. When it didn't serve the intended purpose, he shelved LSD substance for 5 years. And when he came back to it and resynthesized it, he accidentally ingested a small amount. And eureka, cue the angels singing. He discovered its hallucinatory effects. He describes it as follows. I was affected by a remarkable restlessness combined with a slight dizziness. At home, I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant, intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I found the daylight to be unpleasantly glaring. I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. After about 2 hours, this condition faded away. Now, LSD, believe it or not, was actually introduced as a commercial medication under the trade name Delicid for various psychiatric uses in 1947. During the 1950s and 60s, there was a great deal of research done using LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin as medicine for depression and addiction, particularly alcoholism. Now listen to this. Results indicated a 50% cure rate for alcoholism using LSD. Now these were people that came from AA who are chronic relapsers. They could not get sober in AA using its methods. So this was sort of a last ditch effort to overcome their addiction. And it had a 50% success rate. That's absolutely astounding. Now, the CIA studied it for, I think, nefarious purposes like mind control or as a truth serum. And Charles Manson drugged his followers with LSD, thinking it would put people in a state of profound suggestibility. Known as the Johnny Appleseed of LSD, Al Hubbard, this gentleman right here, was a Christian who believed an angel spoke to him and told him that he would bring enlightenment to the world. He was on a hike. And then he became later introduced to LSD and thought this was the method by which he was going to bring societal transformation. And he wanted to give LSD not to the general public, but only to the leaders, thinking that then enlightenment would kind of trickle down to the masses. So he focused on politicians and clergy and professors and heads of industry and the like. But then Harvard psychologist Timothy Leary partook of this substance, LSD, and he wanted to give it to everybody. He's very democratic in this sense, and he thought society would become enlightened from the bottom up. Larry became the preeminent evangelist for psychedelics, and with catchy phrases such as turn on, tune in, drop out, and think for yourself and question authority, he endeared himself to the counterculture crowd, but not so much to the government and parents of teenagers. Many historians hold Leary responsible for the hippie movement. And let's be honest, the counterculture of the 1960s did a very poor job of branding psychedelics. Now, urban legends developed about psychedelics, like people who were tripping would stare at the sun until they went blind. These actually turned out not to be true. However, there were some rare incidents where people did jump off balconies believing they could fly. So the public's opinion about psychedelics began to change in the 60s. And then, of course, this gentleman, President Nixon, he referred to Timothy Leary as the most dangerous man in America. Nixon believed LSD was making 18-year-old boys unwilling to go to Vietnam to kill and to die, and he was probably right. So in 1970, Nixon placed several psychedelics on the Schedule I list of narcotics, which were defined as having no medical use whatsoever and considered highly addictive. Now, some drugs on this are heroin and cocaine, which are addictive, and they still have some medical use as painkillers and were being used at the time for that. But psychedelics had a lot of medical uses. So I think this was very politically motivated, sticking these types of substances on the Schedule I list. It definitely was not helping support at home for the war. Psychedelics have not only been used in the past for therapeutic reasons or recreationally by hippies, they have also been used for their creative properties. Now, it was either Steve Wozniak or Steve Jobs or both who said that what differentiated Apple computers from Microsoft was LSD. Bill Gates did respond to this comment, responded to Jobs and Wozniak, claiming, hey, I tried psychedelics too. Many creative types have extolled the inspiration received through psychedelic use. And you're probably aware that CEOs and other executives from Silicon Valley are renowned for using psychedelics for business purposes, to create innovation. And of course, artists have used them as a kind of creative muse. The married artists Alex and Allison Gray first tried psychedelics in college. In fact, that's how they met. And they have since used psychedelics not only for artistic inspiration, but for an expanded spirituality. They've actually recently opened up an art chapel where people go on retreats, look at beautiful art, but also go through meditation and spiritual experiences. I believe this couple has tried almost every variety of psychotropic substance. Alex said, "My art has always been in response to visions. Rather than confine myself to representations of the outer worlds, I include portrayals of multidimensional imaginal realms that pull us towards consciousness evolution." Now, an artist friend of mine refers to psilocybin as the mother because it is a gentler experience than other psychedelics, relying on her for this description. She believes it has a nurturing quality, hence she calls it the mother. In the late 1990s, research into these substances picked up again, mainly using psilocybin and not LSD. And there's two reasons why LSD was not practical. One, LSD had a lot of negative baggage carried over from the 60s and 70s. And an LSD trip apparently lasts 10 to 12 hours, whereas a psilocybin trip only lasts 4 to 6. Therefore, researchers can have a regular 8-hour workday when working with patients using psilocybin. And right now, the FDA is very supportive of this research. Now, a major portion of my information about the psychedelic world and experience comes from this best-selling book, a New York Times best-selling book by Michael Pollan on psychedelics, How to Change Your Mind. Michael Pollan, as a result of writing this book, has been on nearly every major TV talk show and YouTube channel. He's all over the place. One reason for the widespread positive reception of this book and its author is the fact that Michael Pollan is about as mild-mannered and sober-minded as you can imagine. He's normally a food critic and food expert. He described himself before writing this book as a strict materialist. And forgive his lack of political correctness in this phrase, he referred to himself as spiritually retarded. Those are his actual words. Pollan was initially drawn to this subject when he heard about the research being done by Professor Roland Griffiths, who's at the right, on the left here, Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University. He was doing research with psilocybin and cancer patients, particularly those with a terminal diagnosis. They were experiencing a lot of anxiety about their impending death. Now, Pollan interviewed several of these subjects, and one atheist woman told Michael Pollan that under the influence of psilocybin, she felt, quote, bathed in God's love, unquote. When Pollan questioned her about why an atheist would use the word God, she said that that was the only word we have that is big enough to describe the experience. Bathed in God's love. Now, who among us wouldn't want to experience something like that? Johns Hopkins, I need to point out, has guides and therapists with their patients. They tell takers of psilocybin to surrender to the experience, to trust that everything will be fine. And that seems to be the key to a positive experience. If somebody resists their ego dissolving, which is what often happens in these experiences, if they resist, often they're going to experience anxiety, and it will be a negative experience. So these therapists and guys always tell them, just surrender. If you see a dragon, don't run away from it. Go towards it. Besides having an attitude of surrender, the positive or negative effect of psychedelics seems to also depend on set and setting. That means our environment plays a large role in our experience. If you are in a messy room with the television on, you're going to have a very different experience, probably not as pleasant, than if you were out in nature or you have your eyes closed while listening to Mozart. Also, our intentions in taking the substances seems to play a significant role. If you want to overcome an addiction or want to have a spiritual experience, then you will have a different type of experience than if you just want to trip out at a rock concert. So set and setting is the terminology. Pollan describes the most common descriptions given for the experience of psychedelics as greater connection with the natural world and other people, and the dissolution of ego. That is, the sense of the loss of a personal self, but retaining the ability to observe and notice the world at a much, much greater level of intensity. Synesthesia is also a common experience. That is one that occurs when a sensory experience activates involuntarily another sensory aptitude, such as you will taste colors, or you'll see shapes when you hear music, or various colors when you hear music. Many artists have suffered from that. Vasily Kandinsky was one of them. Michael Pollan said one of his biggest takeaways from researching for this book is that the opposite of spirituality is not materialism. He thought supernaturalism and spirituality were the same thing. But after doing his own experimentation in researching for this book, he came to a different conclusion. The opposite of spirituality is not materialism, it's egotism. The other big takeaway that he had is that love is the most important experience in the universe. Now, let me ask you, does that sound like psychedelics offer a legitimate spiritual or religious experience? Whatever our prejudices or presuppositions about psychedelics, they do seem to offer people, if they do the proper setting, a real, vital, authentic spiritual experience. According to Pollan, it is our ego that creates and controls the borders we have about life, between the self and nature and between self and other people. This separation that our brain does allows us to navigate through the world. When these borders dissolve temporarily under the influence of psychedelic substances, we experience a greater connection to the world, including other people. We also become aware that plant life has its own consciousness. Now, I think I ought to offer a bit of warning to those of you who consider yourselves Republicans. You might be a little leery of taking these substances because you might come out of your trip a Democrat. Here's the spiritual reason people do try psychedelics. This is how our brain usually operates: a jumble of thoughts, most of which have no relation to one another. A real chaotic assault of ideas and sensations that keep us in a constant state of low-grade stress. Now, we don't experience this as a constant stress because we're used to it. We've lived with this our entire conscious life. It's our normal state of being. But once we experience just a teeny break from this constant mind chatter, an experience of inner calm, rest, and peace, we realize how unpleasant our normal state of being is. Researchers had patients take psilocybin and then get an fMRI that you see here. It's a tube for a brain scan. They found that psilocybin binds to our serotonin receptors and downregulates or shuts down our default mode network. Now, I didn't know what a default mode network is. I never knew we had one. But Michael Pollan likened the default mode network to the orchestra conductor in our brain, or it's kind of like Grand Central Station. It allows the executive function in the cortex to communicate with deeper and older parts of the brain responsible for memory and emotion. So among the many mental activities, the default mode network is responsible for self-reflection, time travel into the future or the past. And if you think about it, when we are in the future or the past, we tend to be worrying or fearful. The DMN, the default mode network, also is responsible for the stories we believe about ourselves, which gives us a sense of enduring identity. Psilocybin makes the default mode network inactive so that the monkey mind is silenced. And thus we experience ego dissolution, so we feel more connected with nature and other people. We also let go for a time of the negative stories we have about ourselves. There's a split in consciousness between the self and self-consciousness. We are not the same as our ego. Now, longtime meditators were also given the fMRI. And when I say long-term meditators, 20 years they've been meditating. So a very disciplined practice over a long period of time. And it turns out they were asked to meditate while they were in this fMRI tube, and their brains were scanned, and their brains look exactly like the brain scans of the psilocybin patients. Now, remember, it's taken 20 years for these meditators to be able to silence the chatter. Psilocybin patients, it seems to have happened instantly. So we can experience a brief break through the practice of meditation and experience real, vital spiritual experiences after several years of practice, or immediately through psychedelic use. Now, many people feel their spiritual life should be earned, and so they are against relying on psychedelics for one's spiritual formation. What do you think? Well, you'll have a chance in the Q&A time at the end here to offer your responses. Now let's look briefly at our ancestors and see if they might have used these substances to enhance their own spiritual journeys. I'm going to show you 4 slides from churches, most of which are in Europe in the Middle Ages. And I'm going to let you see for yourself and judge for yourself whether you believe these images from churches indicate that people were using mushrooms, magic mushrooms, in order to have vital religious experiences. Let me go back one slide. Look at that. And now look at that. This is Adam and Eve. And this is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Here's another one. You could see at the bottom right of this fresco there, you see 3 mushroom-looking plant species. And then look at the right side, above the 4 people on the right side, looks to be 5 mushroom caps. These were all found in churches. And then this image of Jesus blessing what appears to be 4 types of mushrooms in very interesting colors as well. Now, if you're curious about the possible use of psychedelics in the history of the church, you can examine the case further with this book, The Psychedelic Gospels, The Secret History of Hallucinogens in Christianity, by Jerry B. Brown and Julie M. Brown. I have not read this. I did read an article that they wrote summarizing their arguments. I'm not going to argue either way for it. I'll let you just do your own exploration and decide for yourself. However, I would recommend Michael Pollan's book as the best introduction to this topic. As an avowed atheist and materialist, Michael Pollan found through his own experience on magic mushrooms as well as LSD that he was able to have a spiritual experience and integrate the experience for long-term positive results by beginning a practice of meditation. He was never a meditator before, but after his psychedelic experience, he was inspired to take up meditation as a regular practice. And that helped him integrate the experience into his life and sustain some of the positive results. Now, all the research I've seen seems unanimous that psilocybin, the agent of magic mushrooms, produces a greater sense of connectedness to the natural world, including other humans. And therefore, Michael Pollan sees mushrooms as a potential medicine for 2 societal crises: the environmental crisis and tribalism. There's a great documentary out called Fantastic Fungi, and it features Paul Stamets, who is a world-renowned expert on mushrooms, not simply the psychedelic kind, but the poisonous kind and the kind we cook with as well. This documentary is about all of it. And it's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. So even if you're not even interested in the subject, if you watch this, you'll be entertained. Now, Stamets believes mushrooms are God's messenger. Now, this sounds maybe like inflated language, but when you look into the research, you might become a believer yourself. Now, I'm not recommending, I'm going to make this clear, any one of us try these substances. I'm just presenting the information. Psychedelics do seem to have a positive impact on creativity and produce an overall sense of well-being when done with a trained therapist or guide. And so I need to stress that, when done with a trained therapist or guide. Now, we'll close with some words of caution. The studies at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere are highly controlled settings. Many people who take psychedelics on their own or with friends do not experience the same long-lasting positive effects. Alcoholics who trip out at parties don't experience the same level of freedom from their addiction as the people in the clinical experiments. It seems that doing psychedelics with a coach or therapist of some kind is very critical for achieving a positive result. So, what do you think? Is this something that you feel people should try? If they want to have a vital spiritual experience, if they want to relieve their anxiety, perhaps they're a cancer patient, or if they want to find relief from their addiction. I'm just very curious to see what your all's opinion of this is. So the floor is now open.